Imagine standing in a courtroom, lights glaring down, cameras capturing every second, and the man you promised your life to laughs at you in front of everyone. He calls you worthless. He mocks your efforts. That was Emily's reality, and what happened next changed everything. Before we get into this jaw-dropping story, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe for more unbelievable true-life drama stories like this one. You won't want to miss a second. Emily's hands were trembling, and her heart was racing like a drum. Mark, her husband of 7 years, leaned back in his chair, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. "Seriously, Emily," he said, voice dripping with arrogance. "You've contributed nothing to this marriage. Nothing. I don't even know why anyone would take you seriously." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Emily's knees nearly buckled, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. 7 years of marriage had taught her many things, but public humiliation had never been one she wanted to experience. The judge, an older man with a calm, watchful presence, raised his eyebrows but remained silent. He had seen his fair share of messy divorce cases, but the cold cruelty in Mark's tone was something else entirely. Emily's mind raced. She could feel every eye on her, every whisper behind her back, and the weight of her years of patience pressing down. She had tried to be a good wife, a supportive partner, someone who made sacrifices quietly, and yet here she was, reduced to a laughingstock. Then, the courtroom doors opened, and the air changed. Everyone's attention snapped to the entrance. Evelyn, Mark's mother, walked in. She moved like a force of nature, graceful but impossible to ignore. Heads turned, whispers started, and Mark's smirk faltered. "Mom?" he asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time in years. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, landing on Emily, then slowly on Mark. The room felt charged, like electricity before a storm. Evelyn's heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the bench, and when she spoke, her voice carried weight that silenced the entire room. "Mark," she said, measured and cold, "I cannot stay silent while you belittle your wife. Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of every family, and you've forgotten that." Mark's face went pale. The arrogance he had worn like armor for so long cracked under the force of his mother's gaze. Emily felt a spark of hope. Someone, his own mother, was publicly seeing her, acknowledging her worth. For years, she had felt invisible in her own marriage, her efforts unnoticed, her loyalty dismissed. Evelyn continued, her tone unwavering. "Emily has given her loyalty, her love, and her full support to this family. And yet, here she stands mocked, as if her worth can be measured by what you think she lacks." The courtroom was still. People exchanged glances. They were seeing Emily in a new light, strong, dignified, unbroken. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The confidence that had carried him through life, the smugness that had made him believe he could humiliate anyone, was gone. He felt exposed, and for the first time, he realized that his arrogance had consequences. Evelyn's words were not just a reprimand. They were a public revelation of everything he had failed to see. Emily drew in a shaky breath, but stood her ground. "Thank you, Mrs. Evelyn," she said softly but firmly. "I needed someone to see me for who I really am, not just for what I don't have." There was a murmur of agreement in the courtroom. For the first time in years, Emily felt seen, validated, and, most importantly, respected. Evelyn turned her gaze back to her son, unwavering. "Mark, it's never too late to change. But real change begins with humility, acknowledgement, and respect. Remember that." She sat down, leaving him to face the weight of her words, and Emily could feel a wave of calm washing over her. The judge cleared his throat and called for the next proceedings, but the energy in the room had shifted. Emily stood taller, more confident, her heart steadier. Mark, however, felt the first sting of humility he had ever truly experienced. He had mocked his wife for having nothing, but in reality, he was the one who had revealed just how much he truly lacked. The courtroom buzzed with whispers and curiosity, but Emily's mind was focused on one thing. She had survived, she had been acknowledged, and for the first time in years, she felt powerful. What happened next would test every fiber of her strength and change the course of their lives forever. The courtroom had barely settled when the next phase of the trial began, and Emily felt a strange mixture of fear and determination coursing through her. Mark, once so confident and untouchable, now sat rigid in his seat, his jaw tight, eyes darting nervously toward his mother, and then to Emily. He was no longer the man in control. The tables had turned, and he could feel it deep in his bones. Emily took a deep breath, feeling a surge of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She knew that this was her moment, not just to defend herself, but to take back the dignity that had been stolen from her. As the lawyers presented their arguments, Mark tried to interject, trying to regain control, but Evelyn's presence loomed over him like a shadow. Every time he opened his mouth to mock Emily, her gaze cut through him, silent but devastating. Emily's attorney, a sharp, confident woman named Laura, seized the moment. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "we are not just discussing money or property today. We are discussing respect, loyalty, and the very essence of what a marriage should be. Emily has sacrificed, supported, and loved consistently. Mark, on the other hand, has undermined, humiliated, and dismissed her contributions at every turn." The courtroom murmured, nodding in agreement, and Mark shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his public image was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Mark's lawyer tried to interject, attempting to paint Emily as unmotivated and dependent, but Evelyn rose from her seat, silencing the room with a single look. "Enough," she said, her voice firm. "I have raised this man, and I know what he is capable of. But I also know that mocking someone for their perceived nothingness is not strength, it is weakness. Emily is strong. Emily is worthy. And Mark, you would do well to remember that." The words hit him harder than any legal argument could. He had built his life on arrogance, charm, and control, and suddenly, all of it seemed hollow. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, not from fear, but from the realization that she was finally being seen for who she really was. The whispers in the courtroom, the judgmental stares, the shock on everyone's faces, none of it mattered anymore. She had endured years of emotional neglect, subtle ridicule, and open humiliation, and yet here she was, standing tall while her abuser was faltering. The trial continued with testimonies from friends, colleagues, and even neighbors. They painted a vivid picture of Emily's tireless efforts to maintain the household, support Mark's career ambitions, and nurture their relationship despite his constant disdain. Each story, each piece of evidence, chipped away at the carefully constructed image Mark had projected. The courtroom watched as the narrative shifted from a successful husband versus lazy wife to a story of resilience, courage, and silent strength. Mark's frustration grew with every passing moment. He could feel his mother's disapproval like a weight pressing down on him, and he could see Emily's newfound confidence radiating from her every gesture, every word. He had mocked her publicly, believing that his wealth and status gave him absolute power, but now he realized that true power wasn't measured in money. It was measured in character, integrity, and respect. Evelyn leaned slightly toward Emily and whispered, "Stay strong. You've got this." Emily nodded subtly, drawing strength from the alliance she had never expected and from the vindication she had finally received. The courtroom, once a place of humiliation, had become a stage for her triumph. As the day wore on, Mark grew increasingly desperate. He tried to argue, to assert control, to manipulate perceptions, but the truth was becoming undeniable. Emily's story, supported by witnesses and reinforced by Evelyn's unwavering presence, resonated with everyone in the room. People began to see Mark not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who had consistently failed to respect those closest to him. Finally, as the sun began to dip outside the large courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, the judge called for a recess. The tension in the room was palpable, and Emily felt the exhaustion of the day settle in, but she also felt a quiet pride. She had survived the initial wave of cruelty, faced public humiliation, and emerged with her dignity intact. Mark sat alone, staring blankly at the floor. For the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, not in abstract, but in real time, in front of everyone he thought he could impress or intimidate. The arrogance that had fueled his life was gone, replaced by fear, uncertainty, and the realization that he could no longer control the narrative. Emily glanced at Evelyn, who gave her a reassuring nod. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, and Emily knew she was right. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. She had survived the storm, and now, with the support of someone who truly understood her worth, she was ready to face whatever came next. As the courtroom emptied for the day, Emily's steps felt lighter than they had in years. The humiliation, the fear, and the pain were still there, but they no longer defined her. Mark, on the other hand, was left to reckon with the emptiness of his arrogance and the stark reality that mocking someone for having nothing had exposed how much he himself truly lacked. The next morning, the courtroom was buzzing. Reporters and spectators filled every seat, their whispers like a low hum of anticipation. News of Evelyn's bold confrontation the day before had gone viral. Mark Hale, the arrogant millionaire, humiliated in front of everyone by his own mother. Emily felt a mixture of anxiety and quiet satisfaction. Today would be harder, and she knew it. Mark would try everything to regain control, to assert his dominance, but she had learned something crucial. She didn't need anyone's approval to stand tall anymore. Mark entered the room first, looking pale and tense, his expensive suit feeling like armor that no longer protected him. He avoided Evelyn's gaze, though he could feel the weight of her disapproval like a physical presence. Emily walked in behind him, her posture calm, collected, almost regal. The whispers in the courtroom followed her, but she ignored them. She didn't need validation. The truth of her strength was already clear in her own mind. The judge called the session to order, and the tension in the room thickened. Mark's lawyer started aggressively, trying to portray Emily as incapable, irresponsible, and unworthy of any claim. But every accusation was met with witnesses ready to testify. Colleagues described Emily's meticulous handling of the household finances. Friends recounted countless acts of loyalty and support she had given to Mark, and even neighbors spoke of her kindness and resilience. With each testimony, the illusion of Mark's superiority crumbled further. Mark's frustration grew. He could sense the courtroom turning against him. His mother's presence was a constant reminder that he could no longer act without consequence. He shot Emily a glare, a mix of anger and desperation, as if she were somehow responsible for his unraveling. But Emily met his gaze steadily, calm and unshaken. She had faced the worst of him, and nothing he could say now would make her feel small again. Then, just as Mark opened his mouth to launch another attack, Evelyn stood. "Mark, enough," she said sharply, her voice carrying across the room like a whip. "Do you not see what you are doing? You are destroying your own reputation, and more importantly, your integrity. Emily has been nothing but devoted. You have mocked her, dismissed her, and now you continue to try to discredit her publicly. Shame on you." The courtroom fell silent. Even Mark's lawyer looked uneasy. Evelyn's words were like a spotlight, exposing every flaw, every misstep, every shred of arrogance Mark had tried to hide. Emily's heart raced, but in a good way this time. She realized something vital. She wasn't just defending herself. She was witnessing the collapse of the man who had made her feel invisible for years. She had been silenced, laughed at, and underestimated, but now, everyone could see the truth. As the day progressed, the courtroom drama intensified. Evidence of Mark's financial mismanagement and emotional neglect was presented, revealing a pattern of behavior that painted him in a far harsher light than Emily's years of patience had allowed. Witnesses described instances where he had publicly humiliated her, belittled her achievements, and ignored her needs, all while expecting perfection in return. The courtroom shifted from sympathy for Emily to outrage at Mark's arrogance. Mark's panic became palpable. He had always relied on wealth, charm, and intimidation to control situations, but now those tools were useless. Evelyn leaned forward in her seat, her eyes fixed on him. "This is the result of arrogance unchecked," she whispered quietly to Emily, and Emily felt a wave of vindication. She wasn't just surviving this trial. She was thriving in her truth. Then came the unexpected twist. A woman who had worked with Emily in a charitable organization stepped forward. She revealed that Mark had been misrepresenting their contributions, taking credit for Emily's efforts, and even sabotaging her attempts to gain recognition. Gasps filled the room. Emily's reputation, once under attack, was now shining brighter than ever. People looked at her not with pity, but with admiration. The same husband who had mocked her for having nothing was now exposed for taking her everything and pretending it was his own. Mark's face turned red with anger and shame. His mother's eyes bored into him like daggers. He had underestimated Emily and overestimated his own power. He tried to speak, tried to regain control, but the room had shifted. Every whisper, every glance, every piece of evidence was now against him. Emily felt a surge of courage. She didn't need to speak much. Her strength was evident in every step, every look, every calm breath. She had endured years of mockery, humiliation, and neglect, but now she was unstoppable. Mark had tried to define her worth, but the courtroom, the witnesses, and even his own mother had redefined it for him. By the end of the day, Mark was exhausted, defeated not just legally but emotionally. Emily left the courtroom with a newfound sense of power and freedom. The whispers that had once made her feel small now seemed to celebrate her resilience. Evelyn walked beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. "This is only the beginning," she said. "But you've already won the most important battle, yourself." Mark stayed behind, staring at the empty courtroom. He had mocked his wife, ridiculed her, and tried to diminish her worth, but now he faced the consequences. The arrogance that had carried him through life had crumbled, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and finally aware of how much he had lost. Emily, on the other hand, had reclaimed her dignity. She had survived humiliation, emerged stronger, and discovered a power she hadn't known existed. The next chapters of her life, and the final resolution of the courtroom drama, were still ahead, but she was ready. For the first time, she felt untouchable, not because of wealth or status, but because she had claimed her truth. The courtroom was electric. Cameras flashed, spectators whispered, and the tension was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Mark Hale had spent the morning scrambling to defend himself, but everything he tried only made him look worse. His arrogance, once a shield, now made him a target. Emily sat tall and composed, her calm a stark contrast to the panic radiating from her husband. She had endured humiliation, ridicule, and neglect for years, and now, for the first time, the world could see the truth. The judge's gavel hit the desk. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice firm. "We are here to hear the final testimonies." Mark's lawyer, desperate, tried to interject, but Evelyn, seated near the front, raised a hand. "No," she said sharply. "We are done with lies." The room went silent. Evelyn's presence alone carried more authority than any lawyer's argument. Mark's smug confidence cracked further as he realized he was fighting not just the law, but the combined force of truth, loyalty, and integrity. Then came the bombshell. A former business associate of Mark's stood and handed over documents that had been carefully hidden for years. The papers revealed that Mark had systematically misrepresented finances, taking credit for Emily's contributions while simultaneously undermining her at every turn. Whispers erupted in the courtroom. Emily's attorney, Laura, leaned in, her eyes bright with satisfaction. "Your Honor," she said, "this evidence proves the deliberate pattern of deception and humiliation that my client endured. This is not simply a divorce. It is a record of emotional abuse and manipulation." Mark's face went pale, sweat forming at his temples. He opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn shook her head. "Silence," she commanded. "No excuses. You should have treated her with respect from day one." Mark's hands trembled on the table. The man who had once mocked his wife for having nothing was now exposed as the very embodiment of greed and cruelty. Emily felt a strange sense of triumph, but also relief. She had survived the storm, and now, everything she had endured was finally being acknowledged. She realized that strength wasn't loud or confrontational. It was unwavering, patient, and resilient. The witnesses testified to her sacrifices, her quiet support, and the countless ways she had held the family together despite Mark's arrogance. Each story reinforced the image of Emily not as someone lacking, but as someone invaluable. Then, in a moment that shocked everyone, Evelyn leaned forward and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, I have witnessed this behavior for years. My son has mocked his wife, diminished her value, and attempted to erase her contributions. I will not stand by any longer. Emily is worthy of every ounce of respect, every right, and every consideration. Mark must understand that this is not about wealth. It is about character. The room erupted in whispers. Even Mark's own lawyer looked stunned. Evelyn's words weren't just a rebuke. They were a final verdict in the moral court, independent of any legal ruling. Mark, desperate, finally raised his voice. This is unfair. She. But his protests were weak, faltering. Every accusation, every denial, fell flat under the weight of evidence, witnesses, and the undeniable moral authority of his mother. The courtroom had turned into a stage where truth, courage, and integrity were triumphant, and Mark's years of arrogance were collapsing in real time. Emily felt her chest rise with a deep sense of freedom. She had spent years feeling powerless, invisible, and mocked. But now, in front of everyone, she was recognized, not as someone without, but as someone strong, courageous, and dignified. Mark had mocked her in court for having nothing, yet he was the one who had revealed how empty his character truly was. The final twist came when a private investigator, hired secretly by Emily, presented undeniable proof that Mark had manipulated their finances to his own benefit, trying to minimize her share and maximize his own. The courtroom gasped as Emily calmly reviewed the documents with her attorney. Mark's face drained of color, his confidence shattered. He had spent years mocking her, thinking himself untouchable, and now the evidence spoke louder than his arrogance ever could. Evelyn stood once more, walking slowly toward her son. Her voice, sharp and final, echoed in the silent courtroom. Mark, this is the moment you face the truth. You have mocked, belittled, and disrespected the person who stood by you through everything. You have humiliated her, but it is you who is exposed. Since today, Mark could barely speak. He had underestimated the one person he thought he could control, and now, he faced not just the legal consequences, but the moral reckoning he had long avoided. Emily felt a sense of calm she had never known. This was more than just winning a case. It was reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her worth. Mark had mocked her for having nothing, but she realized that the nothing he accused her of was actually the very foundation of her strength. Wealth, arrogance, and status meant nothing without character. And in that moment, Mark's hollowness became undeniable. The judge finally spoke, his gavel ready. This courtroom has heard the evidence, testimonies, and moral authority presented today. We will adjourn and review all details before issuing the final decision. However, one thing is clear. The integrity and courage displayed here by Emily Hale cannot be denied. The words reverberated through the room. Emily sat back, feeling a wave of relief and quiet triumph wash over her. She had faced ridicule, public humiliation, and emotional cruelty, and emerged stronger, wiser, and respected. As the courtroom emptied, Evelyn put a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You've done more than prove a point," she said softly. "You've shown the world what true strength looks like." Emily smiled faintly, knowing that the final chapter was still ahead, but for the first time, she was no longer afraid. Mark, meanwhile, lingered behind, staring at the empty courtroom. For the first time in his life, he realized that mocking someone for having nothing could expose how hollow he truly was. And this time, there would be no hiding from it. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on the judge as he prepared to deliver the final verdict. Months of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and public humiliation had led to this moment. Emily sat tall, calm, and composed. Gone was the trembling, insecure woman who had been mocked mercilessly. In her place was someone who had reclaimed her dignity, her power, and her voice. Mark sat across from her, pale and tense, his confidence stripped away by his mother's rebuke, the testimony of witnesses, and irrefutable evidence of his deceit. The judge cleared his throat. After reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and conduct presented in this court, it is clear that one party has consistently acted in bad faith, undermining the other both emotionally and financially. Emily Hale has shown strength, integrity, and resilience throughout this trial. Mark Hale, while wealthy and influential, has demonstrated arrogance, cruelty, and a lack of respect for the person he married. Therefore, he paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The courtroom held its breath. The court rules in favor of Emily Hale in full. She shall receive the division of assets as requested, and Mark Hale is ordered to provide additional compensation for emotional distress caused by his deliberate humiliation and manipulation. Gasps filled the room, some of shock, some of satisfaction. Emily felt a surge of vindication. Every insult, every sneer, every sarcastic remark Mark had thrown at her over the years had finally been answered, not with revenge, but with justice. Mark's jaw dropped. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came. For the first time, the arrogance that had defined his life was useless. His mother, Evelyn, gave him a single, piercing glance. "Learn from this," she said quietly but firmly. "You cannot build a life by tearing others down. Respect, humility, and character matter more than wealth. Remember that." Mark's face flushed with shame, and he lowered his gaze. Emily felt a rush of relief and triumph. She had survived years of emotional abuse and public humiliation, and now she had the recognition and justice she deserved. She looked at Evelyn and whispered, "Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." Evelyn smiled, a rare warmth softening her usually stern features. "No, Emily, you did this yourself." I only reminded him, and everyone else, of the truth. The courtroom began to empty, and Emily noticed people staring at her differently now, not as a woman who had nothing, but as someone remarkable, someone courageous, someone worthy of admiration. Her reputation, once belittled, had been restored and strengthened. Mark, meanwhile, lingered, visibly shaken. He had mocked her in court, laughed at her struggles, and dismissed her worth, but now he had nothing to hide behind. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for statements. Emily remained poised, refusing to be dragged into sensationalism. "This is not about revenge," she said calmly. "It's about truth, respect, and standing up for yourself even when no one believes in you. No one should ever be belittled for their worth, because true value isn't measured in money or appearances. It's measured in character, courage, and integrity." Cameras flashed, capturing the moment that would soon go viral. Mark's mother approached him quietly. "You need to reflect," she said. "You lost more than money today. You lost respect, trust, and the chance to be a better man. Learn from this, or you will continue to fail." Mark nodded silently, finally understanding the gravity of his actions. He had mocked his wife for having nothing, but the reality was he had lost almost everything of true value: dignity, credibility, and moral authority. Emily walked away from the courthouse with a lightness she had never felt before. The years of ridicule, fear, and humiliation had not broken her. They had forged her into someone stronger, someone unshakable. Every step she took felt like freedom, every breath like victory. She had faced mockery, deception, and cruelty, and emerged triumphant. Later that evening, as Emily sat quietly in her apartment, she reflected on the journey. The mockery, the pain, the sleepless nights, they had all led to this moment. She realized that the true lesson wasn't revenge or punishment. It was self-worth, resilience, and the courage to stand tall even when the world told you otherwise. She smiled softly, knowing that Mark's downfall wasn't just about legal consequences. It was about truth, character, and the undeniable power of integrity. Mark, alone in his mansion, stared out at the city skyline. Wealth surrounded him, but it was meaningless without respect or love. For years, he had mocked Emily for having nothing, yet he now faced the harsh reality. It was he who truly had nothing of value. Pride, arrogance, and cruelty could no longer protect him. Emily received calls and messages of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers inspired by her story. She had become a symbol of resilience, a woman who had endured the unthinkable and emerged stronger. She knew her life would never be the same, and for the first time in years, that thought brought her peace. As she looked out over the city lights, Emily whispered to herself, "I am enough. I always was." And in that moment, the past, humiliation, fear, mockery, finally released its grip. She had conquered it all, and nothing would ever make her feel small again. The courthouse doors closed behind her, leaving Mark to face the consequences of his arrogance, and Emily to step boldly into a future defined not by what she lacked, but by the strength, courage, and dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. And just like that, a woman who had been mocked for having nothing proved to the world, and to herself, that she was worth everything.